Welcome to week 2. I hope you had a chance to go through all the videos in week 1 and get out there and practice, because I'm going to say it over and over and over again. The only way that this is going to stick is if you practice. My students who've had the best success and who are constantly improving and constantly taking better pictures are the ones that are getting out there and practicing. So this week, if you don't do anything else, if you've decided last week I'm not interested, don't skip this week, because I think Aperture is probably the most fun thing to play with, and it's the thing that's going to change your photography the most. Now, some people hear the word aperture and they're like, oh, that sounds so technical, but don't feel that way. It's actually not technical at all, and I'm going to show you what it is and how it affects your pictures in very easy to understand terms. So let's first of all go back to one of the vocabulary words from last week, and that was depth of field. Now, depth of field is just how much of your image is in focus. So let's take a look at this picture again. So on the left here, we've got a picture of Riley, and you can see everything in front of Riley is out of focus and everything behind Riley is out of focus. But her eyes and her face are completely in focus. This picture here has a very shallow depth of field. So in order to get a shallow depth of field, you manipulate your aperture. And we're going to talk a lot more about this. Now here on the right, I've got the snowman, and you can see the snowman is very in focus, as well as the house in the background is very in focus. So everything's in focus from the front to the back. Now that is called a large depth of field. And that is something that you use for landscapes, anything that you want to keep in focus. You don't want it to blur out. That's when you use a deep or a large depth of field. Now let's talk about what is aperture. Aperture is just a hole or a gap. It's an opening, okay? So it's specifically to photography. It's where the light passes through your camera. So that's all it is. Don't be intimidated by it. It's just a hole, and it opens and it closes to let more light in or less light in. And that affects how your picture looks. So let's take a look here at my camera. I took some pictures here, and let's go to the top left. Now you can see there's a big opening right here. In fact, you can't even see the aperture ring. This is at its widest aperture. So when you hear someone say, I'm shooting wide open, that means the aperture ring is wide open. Now let's go to the one in the middle here. You can see the opening has gotten a little bit smaller. Okay, so we've gone from a super wide open aperture and we keep closing it down. So you're going to hear I'm shooting closed down. That means the aperture ring is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So you can see over here, it continues to get smaller, it continues to get smaller, it continues to get smaller, and then the very bottom right, it's almost like a pinhole, and that is at f/22. So the very first one was at f/1.8, which means it's as wide open as this lens will go. And over here it's at f/22, which is as small, as closed down as my lens will go. And you can see that little tiny pinhole there, and that's where the light is entering your camera. Now let's go ahead and take a look at how changing your aperture changes the look and feel of your photo. So here I've taken just a simple mason jar with some ice water, no big deal. I put it up on my deck. I used a tripod, and then I had the woods in the background. They're probably 20 or 30 feet away from my camera and from the background. So over on the left, I'm shooting wide open. So I've got the wide open aperture ring that you just saw. And you can see what that does to the background. It completely blurs out the background. You can't tell that it's really in front of trees other than the fact that it's green. Here I've closed that aperture down a little bit. Now I'm at f/4.5, and you'll notice as the hole gets smaller, the number gets bigger. That's a little bit confusing, but just remember, as the hole gets smaller, the number gets bigger. All right, so here you can start to see the woods are starting to come into focus, but they're still pretty blurry. Now I'm coming over here to f9, and they're coming even more into focus. Now I'm very far away from the background, so they're still not completely in focus. And then here at f22, you can see that the woods are in focus and the jar is in focus. So you've got a very large depth of field. So let's go into even more detail. So this is a barn. I shot this with my 85mm lens, which we'll talk about in just a second. I shot it on a tripod. So the distance to the subject did not move. Obviously, the barn did not move. And then notice here, the top number is my aperture. So my aperture is going to vary here, okay? So I'm going all the way from f22 to f1.8. My shutter speed is remaining constant. It is not changing. And my ISO, as a refresher, ISO is just the sensitivity to light. I'm on a bright sunny day, so I've got it as low as it'll go, and I'm not changing it at all. So my shutter speed and my ISO are remaining constant. The only thing I'm doing here is I'm changing my aperture because I want you to see how that changes the picture, how it lets in more or less light. All right, so and then up top is sort of a visual representation of what your aperture ring looks like. I showed you what a real aperture ring looks like, and now I have a little drawing here of the aperture ring. And then also kind of the darkness to the lightness below that. So at f22, you can see that it's a very small pinhole. I'm not keeping my shutter open long enough to let very much light in at all, so it's very underexposed. Now as I go to f16, the little pinhole opens up just a little bit more, but you can tell I still don't have enough light in there, so my picture is underexposed. Moving to the right at f11, the hole gets a little bit bigger, the picture gets a little brighter, but it's still underexposed. I continue to move on. f8 is starting to get a little bit more, but not quite. Probably the best picture here is at 5.6. You can see the hole is a little bit larger. It's letting in enough light to light up the barn. It's not letting in so much light that the sky is completely white, but you'll notice the sky is starting to get white because the sky is lighter than the barn itself. I continue to go over at f.4. The hole is getting bigger. The picture is getting brighter. As I continue on, f2.8, it's getting brighter, f2 even brighter, and then at f1.8, you can see I'm starting to lose detail. So whereas on f22, I didn't have any detail in the darkest parts of the picture, over here at f1.8, I'm losing detail in my lightest parts of the picture. So I'm starting to lose the roof, I'm starting to lose the grass, and I've completely lost the sky. So that means my highlights are completely blown out over here, and then on the left, my shadows are clipped. When you hear the word shadows are clipped, it means there's no detail in the shadows. And a practical note, if you were to print these pictures on the left, the blacks would just be solid black, there would be no details, and on the right side, the whites would have no ink. There would be nothing there, no detail. So that's not what you want. You want kind of right in the middle where you have details in the highlights and details in the shadows. Now, this I just added in here. This particular picture is all of those pictures smushed together. And that's what's called high dynamic range. If you have an iPhone, you've probably seen HDR across the top, and you can turn that on or off. And what that attempts to do is make your brightest part of the picture, so remember the sky was the brightest part of the picture, it's trying to get the sky at the right exposure, and then remember over here in the shadows, this was the darkest part of the picture, so it tries to get the shadows correctly exposed. The iPhone does it not so well, but this I've actually taken all of those pictures from f4 to f22. I've put them all together in a program, and so you can see I have all my highlights and all my shadows. This is the way that your eye sees it. So when I were to look at this barn, this is exactly what I see. But your camera has a more difficult time seeing the brightest parts of the picture and the darkest parts of the picture at the same time. You kind of have to expose for either one. So if I get the barn perfect, I'm going to lose some of the sky. If I get the sky perfect, I'm going to lose part of the barn. And so HDR is a way to get all of that. A little more advanced, but I just thought I'd explain what that means. So let's go back to my mason jar example, and I want to show you the left versus the right. So the small number versus the big number. The big hole versus the small hole. Little confusing, but just remember, the smaller the number, the bigger the opening, the more light that it lets in. Now here's how I've always remembered it. I like to think of things in practical ways that I can visualize. So on the left-hand side, when the background is blurry, think of your eyes. If you were to open your eyes really big, stare at something for a long time, it's going to get all blurry, right? If you stare long enough, don't move your eyes, you open them big, it gets all blurry. Well, that's what your lens does. I know it's related, I can't really explain it, but just think of it. Eyes wide open, blurry. Aperture wide open, blurry. Now go to the right. Think of, you wake up in the morning, you don't have your contacts in, you're trying to see your clock. What do? You squint, right? You squint and it becomes more in focus. I don't know why, it has something to do with light refraction, but we don't need to know those details. We just need to know when we squint, things become more clear. Same with your camera. The smaller the hole gets, it's like it's squinting and it's making everything more clear and in focus. So just remember that because it's really hard when you're first learning, just remember wide open means blurry, closed down means squinting, more clear. So let's compare and contrast. Over on the left-hand side, we've got a very blurry background, and as we move right, the background becomes more clear. Here, we have to have a fast shutter speed. Now I'm going to talk all about shutter speed next week, so I'm only going to just touch on it this week. But because the hole is so open, that light is just flowing in very quickly. So you have to have a very fast shutter speed, otherwise it'll just make it all white. So the way I like to explain this is, think of, I'm holding a white poster board, okay? Or no, actually I'm holding a black poster board. And the light is the instrument that is going to etch the picture into the black, right? So if I don't let enough light in, it's only going to etch a little bit and there won't be any picture. If I open the floodgates, the light comes in and it's flowing in and flowing in, flowing in, eventually I'm just going to have an all white poster board. I'm not going to have a picture. And so that's why you need a fast shutter speed when a lot of light's coming in, so it can come in, make the picture, and turn it off before it becomes overexposed or completely white. And then another term that I'm going to tell you is bokeh. So bokeh is the blurry background here. In fact, if we go back a few slides, I'm going to show you this here. This is an out of focus picture of the fair. And I've turned the Ferris wheel and all the lights and the food stands into bokeh. So these little balls of light here, that's what we call bokeh. But bokeh is basically the blurriness that you see in a picture. So let's go ahead and jump back to the chart we were looking at. So you can see this blurry background. We've got a lot of bokeh, very beautiful. It turns maybe messy or distracting backgrounds into really beautiful blur that makes the subject pop. So you can see that the subject pops more off the background on the left than it does on the right. So we don't have bokeh on the right. So now when you go over to the other side, you're going to get very in focus pictures. Like I said before, it's great for landscapes. If you hear the word stop down or close down, that means the aperture ring is gotten very small. It means your eyes are squinting, things are in focus. You're going to need a slower shutter speed because that hole is so small. If you open that hole very quickly, no light's going to get through that hole. So you have to leave it open so the light can flow in and draw that picture. Eventually, if you leave it open too long, it'll wash everything out. But in general, you leave it open longer, you let the light flow, draw the picture, and then you close it down. And we're going to learn all about that in detail next week. And then you can do some fun things that we're going to talk about later in this week's lessons, and that's you can do fun starbursts. So you get nice bokeh to the left when it's wide open, and you can do some cool starbursts on the right when it's closed down. Now let's take another look at this. We're going to keep looking at the mason jars, but it's a great way to keep things constant so you can see the difference. So here I am changing the aperture and I'm keeping the ISO constant, so that never changes. But you see, as I let more light in through the lens, as the hole gets smaller, my shutter speed has to get slower to keep the exposure constant. So you can see that the picture on the left, all the way to the picture on the right, the exposure has not changed. It's all exposed very well. All right. So when my hole is really wide open, I have a very, very fast shutter speed, 1/1250th of a second. So very, very fast, faster than I can demonstrate here. I close the hole down a little bit. The shutter speed slows down to 1/640th of a second. And then I close it a little bit more. It slows down to 1/400th of a second, then 1/200th of a second. 1/80th of a second. Now at f.8, we're starting to get pretty small here. We're getting into the zone, and we're going to talk about this next week as well, where you can't really hold your camera without it getting shaky. So that's why I was on a tripod for this demonstration, because after 1/50th, definitely at 1/20th of a second, 1/10th of a second, 1/6th of a second, it's going to be so slow that you're going to get a blurry picture. So for this purpose of this demo, this is on a tripod. But when we get down to f22, which is so small, I'm out on a bright sunny day, but I still have to leave my shutter open 1/6th of a second in order to let enough light in to expose it the same as the one on the left. So I hope you can see kind of the relation there. As opposed to when I go back to this slide, I didn't change the shutter speed. So as I changed the aperture, it just kept getting brighter and brighter and brighter and brighter until I lost the details. So that's the difference between those two slides. All right, I hope that makes sense. In my bonus materials, I made a little GIF, or is it a GIF? I've heard it both ways, for you of the aperture opening and closing so you can visualize it. Sometimes I think some people learn from seeing a picture, some people learn from seeing a little animation of it. So I'm putting that in there just so you can see what it looks like when your aperture opens and closes, because it's hard to see when you're taking a picture. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions, and make sure you get out there and practice and do the assignments, because the assignments will make this real. Otherwise, it can just kind of float in your head and it doesn't make quite sense. But once you see it on the back of your camera, you'll start to really understand. All right, thanks. And again, let me know if you have any questions.